I think we've got a quorum here. Welcome on a stormy night. Hopefully it holds off. I want to welcome you to the fourth night of historical proof for the New Testament. I'm David Bodenheimer. Once again, we're blessed to have a room full of New Testament expertise and experience. So feel free to ask questions, correct me. Tonight, Rita is not here. She's with our daughter for birthday, so I'm not fully supervised. So hang on to your pews, strap in your seat belts, and if it gets a little rocky, we're going to get through it. We've had some somber times here, and so let me take that to the Lord in prayer, and then we will get started. Father God, we've had some difficult days, weeks, and months. We've seen children shot while praying. We've seen Christians shot. We've had churches shot up, and we found it on our back door, this week, right here in Southport. We are sad for that. It reminds us that we are living in a fallen world, sinful world, and there are some wicked times. Let us not forget, never forget, that when the times are darkest, to turn to you for light, to remember that all of those commandments that are being broken by too many people, that for us to always remember to worship you with all of our heart and soul and mind, and to love our neighbors and to carry out the Great Commission. Let us have courage in these times and carry the gospel to those. It's the best remedy for what's wrong with so many today. In your name we pray. Amen. So last week, we covered one big point. We covered one big point in three different ways. The New Testament is not just the best in class, it's best in all three classes. First, it wins the best documentation Super Bowl, and not by just a little bit, as we saw 10 to 1, sometimes 100 to 1. Second, it wins the championship for most eyewitnesses. Nothing like the New Testament. Most of the sources in ancient times have zero eyewitnesses. And we know that there are dozens of eyewitnesses for the New Testament to support its reliability. Third, we saw the New Testament meets the most independent sources test, more sources than any other ancient record. And we looked how, when you compare Jesus, how many references are there to Jesus in Christian and non-Christian sources? It's 43. And Tiberius Caesar over the entire known world, 10. So 43 to 10. It's a fantastic margin for establishing the authenticity of the New Testament. So the bottom line out of all of those numerical tests, historical tests, the New Testament is the best attested, best authenticated, best supported record in all of ancient history. Today we're going to build on that historical foundation, because that's not all the proof. There's a whole lot more. In fact, the New Testament rests upon an incomparable record of eyewitness testimony, and that will be the backbone of what we're covering today. But first, what are the skeptics saying about this? Well, Bart Ehrman, we've talked about him probably more than he deserves. He says, none of these writers of the New Testament claim to be an eyewitness. Were the stories told by eyewitnesses equally impossible? That's just flat wrong. And we're going to go through why Bart missed it by a country mile. You have others. We looked when we were talking about, does Jesus exist? Where are some of the most vulnerable? Many of them are on college campuses. And for many college students, they are being told that only a small percentage of the New Testament for the teachings and deeds of Jesus are historical or accurate. And then the Jesus Seminar, they're like a fire hose for phony claims about the New Testament. They have things like the Gospels are obscured by myth and legend. And the Last Supper, this is shocking to me, they call it a cult legend. The Last Supper is one of the most powerfully documented facts in the New Testament, and most scholars trace it all the way back to the lips of Jesus. Yet, the Jesus Seminar tells us less than 20% of the sayings and deeds of Jesus ever happened. They're ever historical. So we're going to crush that just like we did all those ancient documents last week. We're going to walk through some of this. But first, before we dive into eyewitnesses, I want to underscore a very basic point, the importance of eyewitness testimony in everything, not just the courtroom, not just for historians, but in fact, in your everyday life. So with that, I am going to do another cross-examination exercise with the great attorney Tom Jarvis. So let me start my direct testimony. The Old Bridge Diner, what a great place. And they have a lobster roll. It is out of this world. You're not going to find a better one anywhere. So with that, I conclude my direct testimony. Your Honor, that concludes it, Judge Kimmerer.
I do have some concern about that, Mr. Bodenheimer. My recollection is that when I eat at Old Bridge quite often, and I've never seen lobster roll on the menu. Can you explain that?
Well, maybe it was just a special or something. Maybe that could be the answer.
And if I recall correctly, when we were discussing this earlier, you mentioned you went there on a Monday night. Is that right?
Now that you say that, that sounds familiar. Yes.
Old Bridge is closed in the evenings, isn't it?
Oh well, I'm old. Maybe I was confused. Could it have been a Tuesday?
But there are restaurants, particularly Italian restaurants, that serve lobster rolls. Is it possible we confuse the two restaurants?
I really thought it was Old Bridge Diner.
But you acknowledge you could be mistaken.
Yes. You have beaten me into a pulp. I surrender. Yeah.
It's always a pleasure.
That is our favorite part of the courtroom, when the witness crumples down behind the witness stand. I say that to underscore a very basic point. If you're heading to the Old Bridge Diner, who do you want to hear from? You want to hear from somebody that is not just an eyewitness, not just they saw the food, not that they heard it was good. You want somebody that has tasted that wonderful Western omelet that Tom and I regularly have there. So just to make it clear, Old Bridge Diner is great, just not for the lobster rolls. But you apply that standard in your everyday life. You ask people for taste witness testimony to restaurants. You ask them for touch witness testimony if you're buying a truck. If you're heading to a doctor, you can look them up, but you feel a whole lot better if you talk to somebody that went to that doctor and survived and said they're great. They really know what they're doing. So that puts it into your everyday context when we talk about eyewitness testimony. It also puts it into context. Eyewitnesses are huge for historians. They are obviously a big deal when we get into the courtroom, Tom and Craig and I, when we did that. They are also particularly important in ancient times because unlike the cases that Tom and Craig and I had where you had a lot of documents, for that time they did not have a lot of documents. So most everything was passed from person to person. Eyewitness testimony was everything. They were the ones that everybody wanted to hear from, so much so that ancient historians would make fun of each other. You didn't use eyewitnesses. Well, you said you used eyewitnesses, but you're just lying. So it is literally the gold standard of evidence in just about every forum you can go into. So in your papers, hopefully everybody has the June version of the Eyewitnesses and Gospel Reliability paper. There are some versions for September, and if you've got the September, you've got a big bonus paper for that. It's got extra good stuff in there. But if you're not following on the pages, it might be because you got a September version of it. So if you turn to the second page, we're going to look at 4 areas that establish eyewitnesses in the New Testament beyond any reasonable objection. And we always start with the Scriptures. We start with the Scriptures, one, because that's where the truth is. We also start with the Scriptures because in the courtroom, we go to the plain language of a statute, plain language of a regulation, plain language of a contract to determine what is the best evidence for anything. And the first quote might not jump out at you, but this is Jesus, and Jesus is saying, you will testify also because you have been with me from the beginning. That is literally the test for an eyewitness. Jesus wanted those to testify that walked with him, that talked with him, that ate with him, that could smell the Sea of Galilee with him. They had the firsthand experience of Jesus and what he said and what he did. So Jesus right up front is establishing the standard for eyewitnesses. Luke, he makes it quite clear he is relying upon eyewitnesses for the Gospel of Luke, and it's even more apparent when you get to Acts of the Apostles. The third quote is from Peter, and he starts off making it clear. He's talking about facts. He says, we are not making up tales. We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He wanted to underscore the fact that when he's saying eyewitnesses, he's talking about what they saw, they heard, they touched. And then the fourth, John, when he says, he who has seen has testified, that is the definition of an eyewitness. And what did they do with that criteria when they had to pick a replacement for Judas? The disciples said, we need somebody that accompanied us all times. So they were looking for replacement apostles who had that firsthand experience from the beginning, had seen, heard, touched Jesus during the time. So you've got a powerful written scriptural record for eyewitnesses right up front. And that just starts the eyewitness references in the New Testament. There's quite a few more. But for those people, and they're not here, but for those for whom we raised our hands, the non-believers in our family, our friends, our neighbors, if they're still skeptical of the New Testament, what happened? The early church fathers and the early church records corroborate what the scriptures say. You have a group of scholars pointing back to the earliest confirmation. One of the most important confirmations is this. Who wrote the Gospels? Matthew, Luke. Let me try that again. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's not a trick question. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yeah, I should have had you guys say it since I can't seem to get it out here. For 200 years, there were more than 10 early church fathers and early church records, 10 that said, these are the authors of the Gospels. So anybody that has a question, they could have asked in that first 200 years, Mark, he wasn't anywhere near it. It must have been Luther. Not right. Nobody contradicted that evidence. And when you have evidence, if you're thinking of the legal scales, you got 10 on this side and 0 opposing it. That's another lopsided victory for reliability of the New Testament. Mark. Now, Mark is, of course, a different case since he's acknowledged as not an eyewitness. So how does he fit into the eyewitness scope? And since we have plenty of biblical scholarship, let me take you through a few key points. Who referred to Mark as my son Mark? Anybody? Does that come to mind for anybody? There was a time that Paul was happy with Mark, and in fact, he said, "Send Mark to me when I'm in prison." They did have a falling out, but the cat's out of the bag when I say 1 Peter 5:13 says, "My son Mark." There's a very close relationship because it was Peter that kind of took him in after the little falling out that Paul and Mark had. But of course, Peter was a source. We know that from the later epistles from Paul. But we can start with corroboration. Peter is a source for Mark. The second fact, there's 25 references to Peter in that little tiny Gospel of Mark. Third, the very first disciple that is referenced in Mark 1:16, Peter. And then the last disciple referenced, Peter, Mark 16:7. They call that in the history halls the inclusio. I just call it bookends. Those bookends are how a writer would show their sources. This is the guy that I'm relying upon. It's Peter. I start with him and I end with him. Another data point, Papias was writing, he knew some of the people at the end of the first century and, wrote up several volumes, second century. He was an early church writer. He referred to Mark as an interpreter of Peter. And he said Mark wrote accurately what he heard from Peter. Justin Martyr refers to Mark as the recollections of Peter. And then if you compare Matthew and Mark, 90% of Mark carries over into Matthew. So how does that prove anything? Some churches were using Matthew because it was bigger, it had more facts, more material in it, including the birth of Jesus. But Mark lasted through the centuries until it's part of our Bible, part of the Gospels. It lasted for a simple reason. The early church knew Peter was the source for Mark. So that's a long way of saying the evidence supporting Peter as the eyewitness source for Mark is pretty much overwhelming when you consider there's nobody that contradicted that in the early days. So think about this. You get a chance to pick your favorite eyewitness. Peter, that's a pretty good one. Simon Peter, Cephas, the rock, the guy that is going to relate to the crowd better than anybody else. He denied Jesus. He had doubts. He had fears. He sometimes spoke before he thought. He related to the crowds. He was the one that preached the sermon at Pentecost, and 3,000 souls were saved. So if you had one eyewitness, and of course we have a lot more, that's a good place to start. But that gives us three right off the bat: Matthew, John, and Peter. And then Luke expressly says he relied upon eyewitnesses, and you can tell as you go through it. Luke is extremely factual, and he has a lot of sources. The fourth trial that's not in the other Gospels, he has access to stories from the women, so that likely supported the early part of Luke, the birth of Jesus. It also supports who was seen at the tomb and the angels and so on. So you got four sets of eyewitness sources supported by ancient church fathers and records. But if that's not enough, we got more. Number three are the legal experts. And, at the top of the page, page 4 in my version, Mark Lanier. I had a brief chance to meet Mark Lanier. He's built the Lanier Theological Library. He's one of the great tort lawyers of our generation. He's won multi-billion-dollar lawsuits. He also has written a book and says, these are eyewitnesses. I've seen a lot of eyewitnesses in my time, and these are eyewitnesses. But since I want to hammer this all the way down, our new deacon, Craig Kimmerer, we were both Navy lawyers in our former life, and Craig, I believe you answered this last time, but for the people that are watching us online, if you can borrow the mic from Tom for just a moment, repeat for the people online, what's your view about whether there's eyewitness support for the New Testament?
You want me to get into the burdens of proof?
Just based on your experience doing lots of depositions, is what Mark Lanier says? Is that consistent with what you see as a lawyer?
Definitely, you want to be able to get people who either, as you alluded to earlier, either saw the fact, or heard the fact, or touched the fact, or tasted the fact, or smelled the fact. And you want to be in a position to have them explain in detail what it is that they observed, that the perception, that making them the percipient witness. And when you have them under oath and you're questioning them, what you'd want to be able to do is get out of them with the greatest specificity the who, what, where, when, why, how. of what it was that they observed.
Excellent. And I'm going to ask the same question to my other good friend, Tom Jarvis, another big-time lawyer in the room. Tom?
Well, I think that in court, people testify under oath. And the effect of that is to reinforce just how solemn and important everything they say is. Liars are going to lie. People who habitually tell the truth, they'll tell the truth, but they tell it with greater consideration and specificity and focus on the facts when they're under oath. And so those eyewitnesses, I think, are very similar to the Gospels in the sense that they understood this is a very solemn and important matter.
Thank you. So let me just sum that up. Mark Lanier, multi-billion-dollar litigator. Craig Kimmerer, I won't say the name of the case, but I know this fact is public. The litigation he worked on, one of them was a $4 billion litigation that he worked for the Navy, and ultimately the Navy prevailed. Tom, he worked multi-billion-dollar IP litigation cases. So if it comes to this, you can always tell your non-believers, my lawyers are better than your lawyers. I've got the big ones, you got nothing. I'm not going to throw my hat into this ring other than to dispel any concern that I have a different opinion. In my cases were puny compared to that. They were in the tens to the hundreds of millions, so not billions. But I did a lot of witnesses, and it was like an electric shock when I was reading some of the materials saying, Gospels, these are eyewitnesses. I thought, how dumb can I be not to see that that's so obvious? But I share the same view. So when Bart says, no, they're not eyewitnesses, you can say, well, Bart, if an eyewitness hits you in the back on Franklin Street, you wouldn't know what an eyewitness is. My lawyers do. And the legal experts say eyewitnesses. But, it's unlikely that, you're going to have a chance to call all four of us into the room to attest to this. So you might need to bring in the historians. And the best historians I know, the best theology historians, one is Gary Habermas. He's written now nearly 4,000 pages on the resurrection. It's a 4-volume set. It is staggering. He's got over 4,200 sources, and he says, these are eyewitnesses. He considers eyewitness testimony to be one of the gold standards for historical authenticity. He's a good place to start, but he also says that another guy is perhaps the best. Gary Habermas's favorite historian, favorite theology expert is Richard Bauckham. Richard's book is only 614 pages long, called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and it is spectacular. I admit, I've only gotten through about 400 pages of this, and in 400 pages, it is remarkable the level of scholarship that Bauckham has put into this. I have not seen anybody that has a complete refutation, even a fair refutation of what Bauckham says. So you got the best experts on your side. Take that to the bank. We got a winning case. So with that, as I turn through my too many pages, many of you are probably aggravated saying, what pages are we on now? So let me say one more thing about Richard Bauckham. He has written books not only on Jesus and the eyewitnesses, he's written a book on gospel women and has an entire chapter on the women as eyewitnesses. He's written a book on Jesus' family and says all of them are eyewitnesses. So he's done a lot of scholarship on this. But let's move to the next section, page 6, the historical and legal standards. What are they? The number one standard, and we talked about this some last week, is how early are the sources? And last week, we talked about you got some very early sources for the New Testament. But the first point we covered briefly last week, the quality of eyewitness testimony for the New Testament is overwhelmingly better than what you have for ancient sources. That's fact number one. Fact number two is the New Testament was written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. Think about what that means. That means if the New Testament was written inaccurately, there were eyewitnesses to say, whoa, I was there. Yeah, I was there from the beginning. That's not what Jesus said. That's not what Jesus did. So it's a check and balance on the accuracy that you still have living eyewitnesses. And you have people like Richard Bauckham says that. Martin Hingel says the personal link between the Jesus tradition and their memory and missionary preaching is historically undeniable. And other scholars make the same point, within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. The last point is a tiny little point in your outline, but I want to make this out of a handout that I handed you, that Acts is written in AD 62. I usually don't get into the detail because a lot of people, there are some people that will be the audience for this, younger people that are not going to have the scholarship. But why does it matter that Acts was written by AD 62? First, that is 32 years after the resurrection. So you still have fresh information about it. Second, the eyewitnesses are still alive. Peter is still alive until the mid-AD 60s. Same with Paul. Same with John. James, the brother of Jesus, he made it to AD 62, so he was there for many of these. All of them could confirm. Luke was written earlier than Acts, because remember, Luke and Acts are like a 2-volume set. They're both written to Theophilus. So if Acts, Luke is saying, what I told you before, what he told before is in the Gospel of Luke. So what is the evidence for Acts in AD 62? One way to look at it is the New Testament is interconnected in an amazing number of different ways. As we previously discussed, Matthew takes 90% from Mark. There's an interaction. Luke wrote both the Gospel and Acts. There's another connection. 1 Timothy, there's a quote in 1 Timothy that comes from Luke, another connection. When you have these kinds of connections, the best way to date any kind of book is to look at the New Testament across the board. There's only 2 people that have done that in the last 50 years. One is John A.T. Robinson, and the other is Jonathan Bernier, with a very fresh analysis. Only 2 comprehensive look at the entire New Testament in a full book-size analysis. They all tell us that the Gospels came before Acts and support a date of AD 62. So that's one set of best scholarship. The second set of best scholarship are the historical analyses of the book of Acts itself. Far and away the 3 best that I've looked at. Carl Armstrong, an entire book looking at every kind of literary, textual, historical factor you can look at. John Mauck, a Chicago litigator who did an amazing historical analysis, and Colin Himmer, who had one of the best analyses. So you've got the best scholarship putting Acts around AD 62. So on the back of your handout, I want you to be in a position where you feel comfortable about this too. How does the book of Acts end? Well, you look in chapter 28, Paul has his pending appeal. He says, I was forced to appeal to Caesar because he got caught in a kangaroo court before Festus, and said, I got to go to Caesar, who sadly turned out to be Nero. He was under house arrest. He just had one guard with him. He was getting to live by himself. You know, he met with the Jewish leaders. He preached to them. Some of them listened, some of them didn't. He had rented quarters in Rome. That tells you this is before AD 64 when Nero burned down Rome. And he had unhindered preaching. So he was preaching to everybody he could about the kingdom of God, unhindered. That tells you it is before July 64, because after Nero burned down Rome, then all of you know he blamed the Christians. And then he started torturing, burning, crucifying Christians. At that point, Christianity became an illegal religion. So, you know, an appeal to Caesar would not make sense if Luke knew about that. All this, you know, leads John Malk and others to say this has to be the end date, AD 62, for when did Luke stop writing Acts. And we can tell that in part by what's missing. The Great Fire, AD 64, not there. The Jewish revolt, not mentioned. In fact, in the book of Acts, the Sanhedrin is still intact, and they're still going after Paul to get him killed by the Romans. Paul's trial is not in there. There are 16 trials in the book of Acts. Why would Luke leave out number 17, the most important of all, the one where you have to imagine Paul would have laid out a defense even more powerful than what Stephen did? The only conclusion you can draw from that is Luke stopped in AD 62, maybe early AD 63. That's the only rational explanation for stopping where he did while Paul is still in prison. And of course, there are a number of martyrdoms listed in the book of Acts. You have James the disciple, you have Stephen, you have Paul who is beaten, but you don't have the Nero persecution of the Christians started in AD 64 in earnest. You don't have the killing of James, the brother of Jesus. You don't have the beheading of Paul, nor the crucifixion of Peter. You know, all of those happened 62 to 65 AD. None of them are mentioned. Certainly they would have been included in Acts, just like James the disciple and Stephen were, if the book was written after AD 62. So I wanted to lay that out for you. I wanted you to have a handout so you can do your own due diligence on the book of Acts, but it is simply crushing, the amount of evidence that tells you that the book of Acts was written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. So let's move on over to page 8. Not only is the New Testament written early, which is one of the most important criteria, the next important criteria is eyewitnesses. We've covered that. There's multiple eyewitnesses, named and unnamed, and multiple sources. And some historians refer to it as multiple attestation. And Gary Habermas has far and away the most important criteria. I think the most important criteria is when Tom Jarvis cross-examines me into a pulp, and when your enemy admits you're right. But multiple sources, another powerful historical factor. So you take those historical criteria, New Testament, super solid because it meets the most rigorous historical criteria. And finally, page 8, how strong is the eyewitness testimony? I mean, the first thing I can say is historians think it's a big deal. You know, it's the strongest evidence, best evidence, strongest evidence. My experience in the courtroom is there are certain judges that think they are the most important person in the courtroom. There's one I'll not mention to Tom because we share a past with him, but I don't want to call him out on record. He might still be judging somewhere. But the most important, for the good judges, who are they looking at? They are looking at the eyewitness. Even in the heavy document cases that Craig and Tom and I did, the judge learns the case by watching the witness and decides, is this a liar or not? And once they decide who the liar is, then they start organizing their view of the case pretty quickly after that. That's why putting liars on is a bad idea. But you, as I mentioned, buying a car, going to a doctor, choosing a restaurant, you use eyewitness witness testimony to make your own personal choices. So for you, your personal experience, historians for their criteria, and for courtroom, eyewitness testimony is a big deal. In fact, often it would be reversible error in the courtroom to exclude the eyewitness testimony. The second point, how many eyewitnesses do you need? There's a couple of good examples in Lee Strobel and J. Warner Wallace about one witness. The Strobel example is a poor kid in Chicago. Strobel was a Chicago Tribune crime reporter back when Chicago was super safe. This poor kid saw a murder, and then the gang came around and shot his two friends, killed them, and shot him in the head. That kid lived. They took the courtroom into the hospital with this poor guy, in really bad shape. One witness, that was the only living witness. He testified against those three gang members, and they put him away. A good example, one witness is enough. So that's why I spent that time with Mark and Peter as a source. If you got Peter, you got a winning case. Matthew, John, all the rest, that's just an embarrassment of riches of evidence. The last trial that I had, they had fired all of my good witnesses, and we managed to bring back the head of manufacturing who had been fired. That was my only witness for a technical issue. We had to show, this was completely counterintuitive, we had to show that increasing this company's production rate by 300% would make the labor cost, unit cost, go up. Well, everybody says, more units, you're going to get more efficient. Maybe on the second production run, but for the first production run, increasing production 300% meant that they had to hire 250 new people to do this really tiny handwork on making these magnesium flares to shoot out the back of helicopters and aircraft. And this one witness, my one technical witness, was able to come in and explain how it was just a nightmare bringing in 250 new people, standing up 2 new plants, and getting all of this new equipment qualified. one witness on that issue, and that turned out to be a pivotal issue because I only had about 5 sentences scattered over 3 documents to support it. It came down to that eyewitness. Thank goodness for Mike. So the last point is the standard of proof, and I should have worn that tie with the tiny nuclear reactor so it'd send out blazing lights to keep everybody awake. Remember, for your faith, 100%, 99% certainty is great. Think about Thomas. He had some doubts. Think about all of the disciples. They had doubts. So maybe they weren't at 100%. Maybe they were at 99% or 75%. But in a historical dispute or a legal dispute, all you have to have is 51% of the evidence. I might have used this example before. If you're playing football, it's the most points. If you're playing soccer, it's the most goals. If you're playing marbles, and you're all too young for that, it's the most marbles that wins. Same with the courtroom, same with history. It's who shows up with the most evidence. But as we've seen in a number of cases, there's a lack of evidence on the other side. And Craig, if you've got access to the microphone, you were discussing this with me last week. What happens when you show up with a bunch of evidence and the other side comes in empty-handed? Where does that leave the parties in the dispute?
Without getting too technical on this, you have, in a legal proceeding, you have 2 types of burdens. Burden of proof, which never shifts, and the burden of going forward with the evidence, which does shift. So if you're a proponent of the birth and life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, you have that burden of proof. It stays with you. It won't shift. But once you present sufficient evidence to meet that burden initially, by going forward, you have the burden of going forward with the evidence, and you meet the burden of proof, then the burden of going forward with the evidence, not the burden of proof, the burden of going forward, shifts to the other side. And what would happen is the other side would then have to come in and meet its burden of going forward with the evidence. And the question I had for David is, what evidence would they have? It's not asking them to prove a negative. You're asking them for specific, objective, credible evidence to show that Jesus of Nazareth never lived, never died, never said the things that are recorded in the New Testament, and never rose from the dead. And you sit down with these folks, look them in the eye, and say, what specific, objective, credible evidence do you have to show that this didn't happen? Now, that's one aspect of this. Now, the other, I'm going to challenge David on this. I didn't talk about this.
I lose again. Go ahead, Craig.
Okay, in your materials, you deal with one standard of proof, the preponderance of the evidence. It's the weight of the evidence. In the law, there are 3 standards. You have the preponderance, which David described, and then you have, and the preponderance of evidence is the lowest standard in civil, non-criminal proceedings, just preponderance of the evidence. If you have allegations of fraud in a non-criminal civil case, the burden of proof goes up to clear and convincing. And then in a criminal case, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So in your materials, you address the standard of proof as being preponderance of the evidence, why shouldn't we insist that we can prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt, not beyond any doubt, because you're always going to run into somebody who's going to say, well, I doubt this or I doubt that. There's always some basis for doubt, but that becomes a question of, is that doubt a reasonable doubt? Meaning, do you have specific, objective, credible evidence that would persuade a reasonable person to the validity of that doubt? So,
That's a great
put
question.
on the table, do you think we can prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt?
For most of these things, yes. You know, there's a few things. For example, you know, Matthew, Luke, and Mark describe a different color of robe that the Romans put on Jesus. In one gospel, it's purple, and in two, it is red. So for that one, we might do the preponderance of standard. But, you know, let me take a step back. That is the beyond a reasonable doubt standard I think we can generally meet. But that is a unique standard for a special situation. It is designed for criminal defendants for whom there is a presumption of innocence. And our system is based on the idea it's better to let off 10 criminals than to convict one innocent person. So that is a special standard for special facts where we are trying to protect a certain interest to the extent that we're willing to be wrong on the other side. For biblical facts, New Testament facts, there's almost complete scholarly agreement on the preponderance of evidence side. The good scholars, the bad scholars, and the in-between scholars generally say preponderance, which means you got to show up with 51% of the evidence. So unless somebody wants to argue that we're going to have a criminal trial for Pontius Pilate, he's a murderer, except for that circumstance, I don't think we have to go to the higher standard. So if you are trying to convince somebody, you don't have to do it to an absolute certainty. You don't have to do it to perfection. The standard that we apply to Alexander the Great, to Julius Caesar, to all of history, ancient and modern, is preponderance, the most facts. And I think that is the correct standard. We have something else going on, and Craig was talking about the one-sided evidence. I drop a footnote for Anderson versus Liberty Lobby. In that case, it was a slander case, defamation case, and one side, Anderson showed up with a stack of evidence like this and said, it was true, we had a good faith basis for our position. The other side, Liberty Lobby, showed up with, we don't think that's true. We deny that. We allege that it's not supported. The basic fact is allegations and denials are not good enough, even at the Supreme Court, even at a initial look at the facts and summary judgment. So I think that's where we really are on this. Whether you look at preponderance or reasonable doubt, we have one-sided evidence. We have the eyewitnesses, they don't. And in that circumstance, we got a shutout. We can show up with Peter, we can show up with Matthew, Mark, the women, the family of Jesus, and many others that say the New Testament is true. We saw it, we heard it, we touched it, these are our facts, and we stand behind them. So I might have taken us into too much detail, and sorry for the, as you can tell, we love this legal stuff. But let me see, any questions? Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making sure I didn't fly off the handle while I was not supervised by Rita. And let me pray us out of here. Dear Jesus, we thank you for coming to earth, for sharing yourself with the people that walked this earth. You sweated with them, you hungered with them, you bled with them, you died for us. But also, you taught the disciples, you taught the apostles, you taught all those that were following, so that they knew the word, they knew the truth, they saw the truth, they heard it, they touched it, and they then spread that gospel throughout Jerusalem, throughout the known world, all the way to Rome, and even when they were tortured and killed, they would not recant. Let us take courage from that. Let us remember to carry out the Great Commission the way they did with all that we've got. In your name we pray. Amen.